Vienna had been the crossroads in the international market while pigs were still running loose in most European towns. And Muslim Arabs had been buying and selling African slaves long before the European slave traders got involved. And when the Ottoman Turks gave Constantinople up completely to the Muslims in 1453, the radical Islamists had been able to take over Constantinople because Turkey had been weakened by the Crusades. The British adopted the word Ottoman as meaning a footstool, and while England was busy fighting the War of the Roses, the Muslim Turks invaded England and would besiege Vienna in 1529 and again in 1532. While Austria was busy with their wars of religion, the Muslim Turks came again in 1683 but were forced back into Turkey, giving Austria all the territory abandoned by the Muslims, including Transylvania. Austria had been ruled by the Catholic Habsburg family since 1273. And while Austria had flexible borders, they faithfully held to the tradition that only children of the king could be heirs to the throne. Before the 30 Years' War, the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II had been in a long war with the Muslims coming up through Transylvania, and his Protestant subjects were revolting against having to fight this war. The Muslims were bringing opium with them from the Golden Crescent, and seeing people nodding off under its influence was fueling people's fears about vampirism from Transylvania. Rudolph II's younger brother, Matthias, was negotiating behind his back with both the Muslims and the Protestants to end the long war, and because of Rudolph II's intransigence towards the cult of Mohammedanism, Matthias took away Rudolph's crown and locked him up as a prisoner in the basement of his castle in Prague, where he died within 10 months in 1612. When Matthias became the Holy Roman Emperor to replace Rudolph II, he claimed to have been bargaining with the Protestants to get their help to fight Muslims, but it wasn't working very well, because the Austrians and the Spanish were busy fighting the English, and the Austrians were fighting the Dutch and the Italians over Trieste in the Oostkock War of 1616 and 1617. Despite being the Holy Roman Emperor, Rudolph II had been interested in everything having to do with the Renaissance, and he collected scientific as well as occult instruments, and he invited a wide array of artists and musicians to his court, wanting to hear about everything from science to manufacturing to scholarly pursuits, from astrology to Judaism, and his prime quest had been to find the philosopher's stone. But when it came to Islam, Rudolph II, as the Holy Roman Emperor, had stayed true to his charge. When Matthias died in Vienna in 1619, within 7 years of becoming the Holy Roman Emperor, the next in line was Ferdinand II, but the Protestants wanted Frederick V to be the King of Bohemia because he favored Protestants. As soon as Matthias had become the Holy Roman Emperor in 1612, Frederick V had married the daughter of the Protestant James VI, and the Catholics in Bavaria gathered to arms to unseat the Protestant sympathizer Frederick V, and they defeated him at the Battle of White Mountain in 1620. Frederick V fled to Protestant Holland, where he became the father of the granddaughter of James VI, who would become the mother of George I of the House of Hanover. And the 30 Years' War had first broken out in 1618 between the Holy Roman Empire Habsburgs and those who sided with the Bohemian Protestants, and Bohemia included the German part of Silesia. Frederick V would have 13 children, and he died at the age of 36 in 1632 on his way back from asking the King of Sweden to help him fight Catholics and thereby win back his throne in Bohemia. And after these negotiations fell through, the Swedish king would be killed on the battlefield that year fighting Catholics in Germany. The Protestants wanted to tax the Catholics to pay for Rudolph II's long war against the Muslims, but they thought they should be exempt from that debt and that only Catholics should have to pay. And when the Cossacks came riding into Austria in 1619 to support the new Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II, the Prince of Transylvania went to Turkey to ask the Muslims for help to fight Ferdinand II, and Ferdinand II's Jesuit advisor told him it was fine to accommodate the Protestants, and at that point all hell broke loose. The Protestants would lose the 30 Years' War, but it was pretty much a Pyrrhic victory for the Holy Roman Empire, a kind of victory named after a battle in 280 BC when the Greeks in Albania had beaten the Romans, but at such a high cost that it was as if they had lost, and so the 30 Years' War was a Pyrrhic victory or a hollow victory. The Swiss had remained neutral and had welcomed refugees into Switzerland, and that incursion of the displaced brought the Black Plague to the Swiss, so even Switzerland did not escape the 30 Years' War. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 gave princes the right to choose the religion of their lands, and Protestants were tolerated, but no Protestant ever governed more land than they could see with the naked eye. So Germany was shattered into many small pieces and no longer thought of itself as the de facto Holy Roman Empire. But people considered themselves to be a spiritually united Catholic kingdom on earth. The 30 Years' War had pretty much been a fight between the countryside Protestants and the fancy Catholic city folk with their enormous cathedrals. And the castle in Prague where Rudolph II and Matthias were living when the war broke out had been indisputably the largest castle in the world. And the good thing about the 30 Years' War was that Martin Luther had gotten people to start reading the New High German. The 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648 had all but extinguished civilization in Germany. 75% of the population was killed off in many states. The German Americans, page 21. Although many kings and princes had been crowned as defenders of the faith, the first Holy Roman Emperor was actually the German Otto I the Great, who had been crowned in the year 962, and Otto had married one of Edward the Elder's daughters just after the English had successfully beaten back the Vikings, although the Vikings would return for a more deadly second wave of invasions in 980, and this time they would stay. Vikings were people who couldn't stand Catholics, so they had built boats to get away from them, and wherever they landed there were always more Catholics, so they resorted to killing them. Vikings sailed until there were no more places where there were no Catholics, and H.G. Wells said that the Vikings especially liked killing nuns. The Vikings left a dearth of historical records in their wake because Vikings didn't write any of it down. And archaeological evidence showed that Vikings went to Greenland and then to America in the 10th century, and they stayed for only a few years because they disliked Indians as much as they disliked Catholics. There had been no fighting between the Vikings and the Indians in North America, just dirty looks passing between them, and a Scandinavian had named America Vinland when one of his crew, who happened to be a Hungarian, found some sour grapes. As Vikings traveled freely in their longboats to inflict raids upon the bucolic European villages and towns, the nobility geared up to fight them with increasingly improved military tactics and better weapons of war. And when resistance to the Vikings at the hands of these official men-at-arms proved formidable, the Norsemen either learned to assimilate or moved back home to Norway. Mounted European warriors wearing chainmail with elaborate suits of armor designed to fight Vikings could only practice their skills for so long in jousting tournaments before the Pope thought of using them for something more purposeful, and that had been the beginning of the chivalric quest to join Crusades to the Holy Land. After the Protestant Reformation in Europe, there would be no more crusading to raise money for the Pope, and with the end of the Crusades, the age of chivalry retreated into the past. But Crusaders had a good run for several hundred years, beginning in 1095, and the primary purpose of going on crusade had been to gain the Pope's support towards one's claim to the throne. Large armies were not required for crusading because the whole point was to return with stories about the religious fervor they had experienced and bringing back testimonies of having witnessed miracles. So crusading was not about gaining or occupying territory in the Holy Land, which turned out to be mostly an endless realm of dust and sand. Recruitment for the Crusades depended upon religious dedication, and indulgences were granted by the Pope for going on crusade, and before long, professional soldiers and men-at-arms for hire became the logical alternative to barefoot peasants carrying pitchforks. The Crusades themselves languished for want of leaders who had to stay home to fight each other over the treasure that had evaded them in the Holy Land. But in general, crusading was so successful that even the Reconquista of Spain was declared a crusade in 1123. The Prussians crusaded up into the Baltics in 1147 alongside their Livonian brothers of the sword, and these Teutonic knights brought salvation to the pagans in the far north, while the Crusaders in the Holy Land won Jerusalem in the summer of 1099, leaving 300 knights and 2,000 men-at-arms behind to guard Jerusalem while everyone else went home. Saladin was a Kurd born in Tikrit, and Saladin conquered Jerusalem in 1187, and 2 years later, Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, went on the Third Crusade to get it back. The English king Richard I the Lionheart joined in for the Third Crusade in 1189, along with the King of France, Philip II, and Duke Leopold of Austria. And Richard I and Duke Leopold were the same age, and the King of France was 8 years their junior. Richard the Lionheart went by sea, while Frederick Barbarossa marched to the Holy Land across Turkey, and the French went through the Alps to Genoa, and then by sea to Jerusalem, while Leopold sailed from the lovely port of Trieste. After some serious fighting with Muslims, Richard the Lionheart entered into negotiations with Saladin's brother, and they signed the Treaty of Jaffa in 1192 that gave Christian pilgrims the right to safely visit all the holy sites. Richard left to return to England, and Saladin died of yellow fever the following year. And the King of France, Philip II, had argued with Richard the Lionheart the previous summer in 1191 and had returned to France early. After concluding his business in the Holy Land, Richard headed back to England in October of 1192, but instead of sailing for home, his ship went up the Adriatic to Trieste, and he walked up to Vienna in disguise, arriving just before Christmas, and his friend Leopold, the Duke of Austria, had him arrested and held captive for 2 years, in which time they tried to figure out how much money they could get out of Richard's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, so they could go on further adventures in the Holy Land. Richard's mother came to Germany and spent a week listening to Leopold singing Minnesänger music. And these songs were how history was being recorded in those days. And the word Minnesang came from the Middle High German word for love song. And Richard's mother would leave and come back and then leave again until she finally paid 150,000 gold marks to make the Austrians force her son Richard I to come back to England. The argument with the King of France had been over Richard the Lionheart spending too much time in his tent with Blondel, who was Leopold's personal musician, and the money Richard's mother would pay was more than twice the yearly revenue of the English crown. Richard's brother John told the Austrians to please keep his brother in Germany, because Richard had failed to produce a child for the royal succession, and his mother had gone to great lengths to bring his bride to catch up with him on crusade, and they were married on the 12th of May in 1191 on the island of Cyprus. Richard's mother had brought the bride to the Holy Land because Richard's younger brother John I was making a fuss about the possibility of Richard the Lionheart coming to a bad end while on crusade, and John I did not want to be the next King of England. Richard took his new bride with him on crusade, but she did not conceive, and after a few months went back to live in France, 100 miles south of Caen. And the King of France offered the Austrians 80,000 marks to keep Richard the Lionheart away from England, because John I's older brother Geoffrey II had fathered a child named Arthur in 1187. And Arthur was next in line after Richard the Lionheart, and Arthur had grown up in France and had become a puppet of the French king, so France was counting on Arthur becoming the next king of England. John I needed to get Arthur back to England where he could be trained to become more loyal to the English cause, and John I had lost hope that Richard the Lionheart would produce any children because he was already 36 years old and his new wife had refused to stay with him any longer in the Holy Land. So John I was conniving with the French king to keep Richard incarcerated in Austria in order to buy John I some time to turn Arthur around before Richard came back and did something drastic to Arthur, which would leave the burdensome crown to John. Eleanor of Aquitaine was hesitating with the ransom money to Richard's friend Leopold. So Leopold sent Richard to the Holy Roman Emperor, who was by now the son of Frederick Barbarossa, and the Holy Roman Emperor made Richard the Lionheart a guest at the Trefel's castle, and within 3 weeks his mother came up with the money. Richard was sent home to England in February of 1194, and he came back from his stay with Leopold in Austria to make the King of France sorry. And within 2 months, Richard sailed for Normandy with 300 ships after making up with his brother John I. Richard besieged French castles for the next 3 years and steadily gained ground and resources until the French king captured the 10-year-old Arthur in 1197 and secreted him away. When Arthur was 12 years old in the spring of 1199, Richard was walking around the camp that surrounded a castle that he was besieging, and he took an arrow from a young boy's crossbow, and the arrow was cut out, but the wound became gangrenous, and Richard's friend Leopold had died 4 years earlier of a crushed foot that had gone to gangrene. And Leopold had died less than a year from the day Richard's mother had convinced Richard I to go back to England, and she had talked him into it because France had become unstoppable. When Richard the Lionheart lay dying at the age of 41, he proclaimed John I the next king rather than Arthur, because John I was at least an English patriot married to an English noblewoman. And the funny business with John I's purported betrayal had merely been his attempt to track down Arthur and repatriate him so John I wouldn't have to be king. John I had been married to an English noblewoman for 10 years when he became the new English king at the age of 32 years, and so far they had produced no children. So as soon as he became king, John I immediately had his marriage annulled and remarried a rich young woman from the south of France whose money could help him fight off the King of France. John I's second wife was maybe 14 years old in the year 1200 when they married, and her birth date remained uncertain, and John I would have 5 children with her after she grew up 7 years later, and the children included the next king, Henry III, born in 1207, and a second son was born in 1209 while Prince Arthur had completely disappeared. Arthur was never heard from again, and the French tried to blame John I for having ordered him to be murdered, but there were as many versions to these speculations as there were Frenchmen telling the tales. John I would be forced to sign the Magna Carta in 1215 because the nobles had turned besieging castles into a fine science, and especially the King of England was no longer safe from what had now become a blood sport and a way of life. Chivalry first grew out of the romanticism of the knights who went off to fight the Crusades, but it developed into a code of rules adhered to by opposing forces engaged in castles siege warfare. The stories of chivalry brought back by the Crusaders returning from the Holy Land were the subject of many songers who travelled from town to town singing for their supper, and they told the historical tales set to music, and the popularity of the minnesongers guaranteed that history would continue to be recorded through these musical stories, and the best of them turned into rock stars. As cities grew, the Minnesonger rock stars turned into actors, and the musical portion of the songs was dropped, and modern poetry was born. And theater became the teaching of chivalry without the poetry or the music. Frederick Barbarossa's grandson was crowned the Holy Roman Emperor and the King of Jerusalem in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 1225, and he managed that not by conquering Arabs in battle, but by learning to speak Arabic. Frederick Barbarossa's grandson started the Teutonic Order, and his Teutonic Knights wore a black cross, not the red one of the simple Crusaders, and 100 years later, Edward III would push the age of chivalry forward in earnest. Frederick Barbarossa had died on the Third Crusade, and his grandson would grow up in Sicily and spend very little time in Germany. And as King of Jerusalem, Barbarossa's grandson ruled for 32 years from his pleasant Mediterranean royal court at Palermo, where he liked to do medical experiments on animals and on prisoners. And he had a man lowered into a volcano to find out if it was the gates of hell, and he had a man dive for the bottom of the ocean until he drowned, and he had babies raised in isolation to see what language they would speak, and Frederick Barbarossa's grandson spoke six languages himself, but mostly he surrounded himself with Sicilians. With civil war breaking out in England, all attempts to gain a foothold in Sicily were abandoned by the English, since it turned out to be cheaper to pay Sicilians to let Englishmen visit Sicily from whence they could keep an eye on the Pope, rather than taking it over by force of arms. Frederick Barbarossa's grandson told such tales of his grandfather's escapades in the Holy Land that he caught the imagination of a Moslem pirate who lived from 1475 to 1546 and terrorized the Mediterranean, and Barbarossa meant Redbeard in Italian, and the Moslem pirate called himself Barbarossa to mirror the legendary German warrior, and the Muslims in Afghanistan heard about Redbeard and started dyeing their own beards red. Barbarossa's grandson fortified enough castles in Swabia and Bohemia and Austria to keep out both the Moslems and the Mongols, while Hungary was being hit hard, and one of the best castles Barbarossa's grandson built was the Teutonic castle at Königsberg in 1257 that would become the seat of the Order of the Black Eagle, the highest order of chivalry in the Kingdom of Prussia. The Teutonic Knights had begun as the Order of the House of St. Mary of the Germans in Jerusalem, and the Order of the Black Eagle would be founded in January of 1701, the same year the British started their House of Hanover, and in large part as a reaction to it. When Hitler was holding out in his bunker in Berlin in April of 1945, the whisper being passed up and down the halls was, "Remember Königsberg." Every German knew about the legend of the siege of Königsberg Castle in 1262, and the castle at Königsberg had been the foremost headquarters of the Teutonic Order, and in the legend, a sea captain from Lübeck had brought the besieged knights relief by boat, coming in the dark of night up the river to the castle, and the Teutonic Knights would be victorious in the end thanks to the brave and resourceful sea captain. Königsberg Castle was right in the heart of Old Prussia, and today the castle is near Kaliningrad's Amber Museum. And that castle was the reason so many German troops became trapped in the Courland pocket during and after the Battle of the Bulge, as they waited for the anticipated Königsberg miracle. The RAF bombed Königsberg Castle on the 26th of August in 1944, using 174 Lancaster bombers, and then again on the 29th of August, with 480 tons of high explosives and incendiaries dropped from 189 Lancasters. The castle was extensively damaged, and by the time the Russians arrived, 90% of the city of Königsberg had already been destroyed. The Soviets got rid of what was left of the Germans, and they renamed the city Kaliningrad and used the port as the base for their Baltic fleet. Kaliningrad was 86 square miles of territory on the coast of the Baltic Sea between Lithuania and Poland, and there was no border in Kaliningrad contiguous with Russia. And because Russians were exceptionally superstitious, and the thick walls of Königsberg Castle had stood up to being bombed by the British, perceived as a bad omen, Brezhnev had every remaining stone blown up in 1968. Himmler had been waiting in his train in the center of the old Teutonic Crusader state of Neumark, and while Goebbels was making movies and Goering was out collecting art, the bulk of the German hierarchy was convinced that Germany would win the war because they had so much musical history to back up their endeavor. Carmina Burana had been written by monks in 1230, after the Crusades and in the wake of the Black Plague, in order to cheer themselves up. And after the Dark Ages, German villages had to endure a few hundred more years of barbarism, including torture with red-hot pincers and pokers, eye gouging and tongues cut off, and foreheads branded with marks to show who was guilty of what and who belonged to whom. The only glimmer of hope in all this cruelty were the traveling musicians singing rock songs, and the mini-songers went a long way towards explaining what was going on and why. When the nobles weren't fighting each other, they were fighting the Pope and his many bishops, and the church had more money than most barons and princes, and when ordinary people heard the mini-songers, they found out about what had been going on in the wider world. While the words and the tunes were constantly altered, the historical characters remained true to actual people. Many of the songs had come from the pre-Christian days of the North Country, and were about the people in the Nordic lands before they mixed with non-Scandinavian Germans, and the mini-songer was a love songer because the rock songs were more about love than about history. It was important that the events of which they sang stayed true to real life in order to give honor and legitimacy to these news reports, so that people with money would be willing to pay a decent fee to host the singers, since the rock songs were basically anonymous and had usually been pieced together from different sources. A variety of versions were later written down, and English poets contributed Beowulf and the Song of Roland, followed by the King Arthur stories by Malory, and Beowulf had been written in the 8th century right before Charlemagne was crowned. The Parzival story went in many different directions in France and in England, and for the Germans, the story grew into the legend of the Fisher King, who was wounded in the groin and could do nothing to help himself, and could only be cured by a stranger's question. When Parzival went to see the Fisher King, he didn't ask what had caused the wound, because Parzival wanted to show that he had polite good manners, yet asking that question had been exactly what was needed to save the dying king, and it would have broken the spell and saved the whole kingdom. Thereafter, the Parzival character went to England to meet the Knights of the Round Table, and then they all went off looking for the Holy Grail, and that they thought would heal the Fisher King, and Zarathustra was one of the knights among them who used laughter instead of a sword. A passage quoted from a rock song in a superb book called The Orphan Stone, the Minnesinger Dream of Reich said, "How like a wolf to weep and say, 'Don't grudge me my paltry prey. I find it where I can. My hunger is great. No blame is mine. The world goes on always the same. Many a fat Jew sits in his house who's never done one bit of good. False advantages are always his, heaps of money and ill-gotten goods. He chides me over a stolen goose. Ja, to be honest, was all my hope. What can I say? It wasn't to be. From hunger I robbed, just to be free. So lay it on them who drove me to theft. The fat are to blame as much as the lean. The Orphan Stone, the Minnesinger Dream of Reich, by Richard J. Burleth, St. Francis College, New York, Greenwood Press, Inc., 1990, page 247. Virtue for the German was not simply a matter of noble birth because the brains and wits of an ordinary man could win him a kingdom. And when the rock songs died out after the German Hohenstaufens reached the end of their line with Barbarossa's grandson in 1250, and the last of the divine kings were replaced by the Habsburgs, the Jews who had found some shelter in the courts of the German kings followed the rest of the wandering Jews into the anonymous hinterlands of Europe. The rock songs had been used to teach about the government, informing the peasants about the structure and function of the nobility by telling stories of the bravery of the kings and queens and courtiers, and people believed in them whether or not they were completely true. The rock songs could be sung by farmers in the field or by soldiers marching off to war, and they spoke to the best in everyone and appealed to everything that was noble and dignified and good. When a collection of the rock songs was finally compiled into one book, it was something of a miracle that a book that old could survive, not only because of its age, but because parchment was precious and was regularly scraped clean and reused. The collection of songs was called the Rhyming Book of the Reich, or the Book of Kaisers, and it was a national icon to the Germanic peoples, and the French kept it locked away in Paris because they didn't want Germany to have anything more to help them in unifying over old glories. In 1888, the Germans raised 400,000 gold marks by popular donations to get it back to the fatherland, and the Kaiser and Bismarck donated their share. The French agreed to sell it because they were paying reparations to the Second Reich after the Franco-Prussian War, and Hitler put it in a cave, and the American army would give it back to Heidelberg University in 1947. Many Europeans retained fond memories of the good old days when kings ruled absolutely and the government was strong, and there had been no questioning over where one's duty and proper loyalty ought to be directed. The swastika had mystical origins to the ancient German peasants living in the sheltered valleys with their farm animals and their local church. And every Sunday after gathering at the church, the father would go out to the barnyard to kill a couple of chickens for the Sunday dinner, and what was left after the meal would go into the week's stew pot to simmer for the remainder of the week. The daughter had pulled out the feathers to save for their bedding, and she brought the properly dressed birds to the mother, who would place 4 legs into a pan to fry for their Sunday feast, and as the son looked over her shoulder and saw the swastika browning in the pan, the young man quickly forgot the little piece of bread they'd been given in the church that morning. German knights had lived in the woods eating roots and berries and drinking pure, clear mountain spring water, and while the Roman Pope had sacraments and indulgences and the comforting ceremony of the Mass, German knights sang stories of their perilous quests in exciting lands full of supernatural encounters, while they performed mighty deeds that required great suffering and courage, but were interspersed with miracles and magic. The knight's code of chivalry was spread by the traveling minnesongers with the help of their intricate musical instruments, and the songs had taught that the nobility were worthy and deserving of the fruits of everyone's labor, and to keep this narrative alive, the nobility eagerly donated to the welfare of the singers, as well as commissioning elaborate tapestries to be embroidered illustrating the stories. Instead of God's grace or divine intervention, German knights survived by their strength and skill with their swords, and the church didn't like the knights who were not dependent on charity but were armored for battle and hardened by want. The Teutonic Knights had a myth about a lost crystal that had been a big heart-shaped jewel on Charlemagne's crown. And the lost crystal had been brought from the east, perhaps from Persia. And the east was das Morgenland, the land of the morning from where the rising sun emerged. The east was magical and promising, and from there the 3 wise men had come, bringing gifts to the Christ child. And the myth of the lost crystal grew as time passed to become a crystal kept safe by the neutral angels during the Lucifer rebellion. There were other myths about magic stones, but the lost crystal was called the pole star of princes, and while nobody knew what color the lost crystal was, they were certain that it had been shaped like a heart, and that there was now only a hole left in the front of Charlemagne's crown where it had once been. The Crusaders had come from Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire, and the grandson of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa was born the week after Richard's friend Leopold died in 1194, and Barbarossa's grandson wanted to create an empire of the Mediterranean while the English were busy trying to colonize France. The rock songs told the story of where Richard's friend Leopold of Austria had gotten so bloody in the fighting in the Holy Land that they had to tie a white sash around him to tell him apart from the others, and that was how the Austrian flag became a white stripe on a crimson background, although another version was that his sash had been removed for some reason, and having been covered in blood from head to toe, it had left a white stripe around his waist. The flag and heraldic arms of the King of Jerusalem was a gold cross potent on a silver field, and the cross potent was an altered swastika or a crutch cross. The grandson of Frederick Barbarossa's grandson was defeated by the French outside Rome in 1268. And the French beheaded him 2 months later at the age of 16, alongside his 18-year-old friend from Baden, with whom he was inseparable. And the heraldic arms of the King of Jerusalem went to the grave with them, even though the French tried to keep the title alive. But after what they did to Conradin, their claim lacked merit. The people of Italy had supported this last Hohenstaufen named Conradin, but the Pope had sided with the French, and the Pope had more money to pay professional soldiers. When Conradin and his friend had tried to flee, their blonde hair gave them away among the population of Italy, and the French captured the crown of Charlemagne along with Conradin, and the lost crystal went missing around 1350 A.D. They put a large heart-shaped sapphire in place of the original stone that had gotten lost somewhere on the way to Jerusalem, but everyone knew it was a meager substitute for the real thing. As soon as news of Barbarossa's death had reached Germany during the Third Crusade, a rock song was written called Das Nibelungenlied that was as long as the Iliad, and Wagner's Ring would be this rock song reconstituted. Fritz Lang made a movie about it in 1924 that Hitler enjoyed watching, and the Kriemhild story in Das Nibelungenlied was about a hidden treasure of gold kept secret because anyone who knew its location would be murdered. Princess Kriemhild's brother had killed her first husband so he could send her off to marry the King of Hungary or Attila the Hun. And that would make her the queen of the Huns, and so Kriemhild had her brother killed, and Wagner was dedicated to bringing this story back to life, and he wrote music to go with it that in some places came close to the original tunes of the Minnesongers. The German theme of betrayal in the rock songs was carried through by the Nazis, who blamed Jews after the Great War for the stab-in-the-back scheme written up in the Versailles Treaty, and German churches preached the story of Jesus as being one of his betrayal rather than promulgating a message of redemption or fulfillment. The Passion Play at Oberammergau was a popular spectacle where the crowd would boo and hiss at the Jewish Judas, and the Mad King Ludwig especially enjoyed attending at Oberammergau, so he could lose himself in the gallant stories about the brave knights of the Crusades. The original folk story told in the rock songs was about the search for a holy grail that could heal a king wounded by his own sacred sword. And the story had first appeared in writing in France around 1190, and it spread from there throughout Europe, and in all the versions, the heroes would disguise themselves so they could find shelter among their enemies, and every time they tried to escape, they would become lost, usually at sea. As the tale reached Germany, it became the story of a beloved, wounded hero named Tristan, and only the willing heart-blood of a godly virgin could save him. And in Tristan's story, two people drank a secret potion put into wine, and they fell in love, even though the woman was supposed to marry the king, so she was given a trial by ordeal with a red-hot iron, but it didn't burn her, so she was allowed to go live in a cave with her lover Tristan. In Spenser's Bower of Bliss from Fairy Queen, they slept on a huge crystal, and the cave was their church, and the bed was their altar, and this sort of private betrothal, without benefit of clergy, was sacred in Germany up until the Council of Trent in 1563. As the story goes, one day the German king came riding through the woods and found the cave and looked in at the beautiful people sleeping there, and he realized that being a king was not as good as being a lover, and to the German poet, even God knew that being God was not as good as being loved. The rock songs were written down in the form of poems, and some of them had musical chords written alongside the poetry, but the actual musical notes were lost, because everyone knew the tunes at the time, so the music may not have ever been written down, just as the tune to Na Nanny Na Na was ubiquitous in all languages and needed no notes to follow in order to follow the tune. The rock songs had been used not just to carry gossip from village to village, and not merely as a source of news, but more importantly it was a who's who, a sort of social register that determined which members of the nobility were recognized as legitimate and worthy of homage, and those who were in decline, and that explained why Richard's mother Eleanor of Aquitaine had come up with the money to force her son back to England, lest the Minnesongers be encouraged to smear his name for all posterity. Rumors had persisted about the old German rhyming book, but it was never found, and some time later what had survived of the rock songs was put together in a book called Die Große Heidelberger Liederhandschrift, that was published by a Mr. Manessa von Manegg sometime during the 13th century. And the Manessa book had been a joint project between the church and the state, but the poems were not exactly history, because it was full of imagination and romance, although most of the characters in it had been real people. The Manessa book had a picture of the German Henry VI with blonde hair, even though he'd had brown hair in real life. And one of the other pictures showed an old man in a bathtub being handed a bottle of wine by several young women. And there was also a liar's song by a man who said how happy he had been before having to admit he was a liar, and that had made him feel like a lump of lead. The bulk of the surviving rock songs were about the Holy Grail and the magic spear, and Wagner's Ring would be revisionist because there had been no politics in the original. The pure good women who had been worshipped by the knights became Furies in Wagner's operas, although he did keep the part about the search for the Holy Grail, and he also kept the idea that the keeper of the Grail must stay anonymous. Christian de Troyes first introduced the legend into France with his Conte del Graal, written in 1190. Here we have a Grail castle and a Grail keeper, a large platter with mysterious attributes, a bleeding lance, and a question that must be asked in order to heal a wounded king and restore fertility to his land. There are indeed Christian overtones in that the platter contains a host which is the sole food of the wounded king. Underneath, however, one can clearly discern the outlines of an ancient Celtic myth describing the visit of a mortal hero to an otherworldly palace. This myth, in its different versions, has certain constant elements: the maimed king, who has usually been wounded with his sacred sword or lance, the barren land, the extraordinary dangers to be surmounted in the quest for the palace, the question that must be asked in order to heal the king and loose his kingdom from its enchantments. The Quest of the Holy Grail, translated and with an introduction by P.M. Matarosso, New York Penguin Books, Viking Penguin Inc., 1969, 1986, page 12 and 13. Wilhelm Richard Wagner was born in Leipzig just when the Congress of Vienna had put Europe back together after Napoleon marched through. And Wagner was born in the Jewish quarter, and he had been his mother's 9th child. Wagner's father died when Wagner was 6 years old, and so his mother moved to Dresden to live with a Mr. Geyer, who had been a friend of her husband, and with whom she would have one last child. And to keep up appearances, Wagner was given the last name Geyer until he was 14 years old. Wagner probably thought Geyer was his biological father, and when Wagner's sister later showed him letters written by Geyer that might have said he was Jewish, Wagner destroyed the letters. Geyer's brother sent Wagner to music school, and Wagner started writing an opera called Der Hochzeit, or The Wedding, when he was 19 years old, but he abandoned it. And the story in The Wedding was about an arranged marriage, and the night before the wedding, the bride's lover came to visit, and she pushed him away, and he fell off the balcony, and she died of grief, lying next to him at the funeral. Wagner would fall in love with an actress named Minna, and he married her in November of 1836, and she would be the breadwinner for the first 2 years of their marriage. Wagner wanted to move to Paris to make money with an opera he'd written called Rienzi, the Last of the Tribunes. So Minna's last performance in Germany was in April of 1839, where she acted in Schiller's Maria Stuart, that was a play about the final days of Mary Queen of Scots, and Minna starred in the title role. Unfortunately, Paris was not interested in Wagner's music, and he was soon put in jail for his debts. And Minna's German friends bailed him out, and a Jewish composer named Meyerbeer obtained a job for Wagner at the Dresden Opera House in 1842 and helped him to put on his Rienzi, the Last of the Tribunes. Meyerbeer was a successful and popular composer who'd been asked to write an opera about Frederick the Great for the opening of the new Berlin Opera House in 1844, and Wagner asked Meyerbeer in 1846 for a loan to keep him going for another year, and Meyerbeer said no, and Wagner started a hate campaign against his former sponsor. Thanks to Meyerbeer, Wagner had been working as the royal court conductor at the Dresden Opera House for 6 years when the Year of Revolutions in 1848 hit, and the opera house in Dresden was burned down by revolutionaries. Most of the artistic types had gotten caught up with the rioting, and Wagner had been one of the most visible, and many Jews had been involved in the Year of Revolutions in 1848, not just because they'd learned to read and write in their Hebrew schools and had gone into business publishing political pamphlets and diatribes in the cheap newspapers, but because when Napoleon had marched across Europe, he freed Jews and turned them into equal citizens. The Congress of Vienna in 1814 had put the Jews back in their place, separating them from the Christians of Europe, and the Jews' desire for further revolutions could not be extinguished and was known as the Jewish emancipation. Many religious Jews thought this was not a good idea, that living in their separate ghettos afforded a sort of protection, because assimilation was dangerous on many levels. But revolutionary young Jews went ahead and wrote pamphlets and articles and proposals to the newspaper, until these socialists were marching in the streets in 1848, and it started in France and quickly spread to all of Europe. Newspapers loved printing the young socialists' radical articles because it sold plenty of copies of newspapers, and Wagner contributed his share of this activist writing. And when the riots were squelched, a warrant was issued for Wagner's arrest. Perhaps the Jewish complicity in the trouble was what turned Wagner so fiercely anti-Semitic rather than his just being turned down for a loan by a Jew. But Wagner dove completely overboard into the old historical German folklore that used Jews as a foil to spotlight the unscrupulous evildoers in ancient Germanic myths, and Wagner became a hero to the Germanics by pointing to the Jews as an example of what Germany decidedly was not. To avoid being arrested for getting involved in the Year of Revolutions in 1848, Wagner went to Switzerland and chose Zurich because that was where the wealthy Manesse family had put together the Manesse Minnesänger book. It should be noted that Minne was his wife's nickname, not her given name, and the nickname came from the German word Minne for courtly or romantic love. One of Wagner's rich fans in Zurich let him live in a house on his estate for the next 6 years, where Wagner was able to work on his opera about the old Tristan and Isolde romance story. And Minne did not want to leave Germany and started taking laudanum. Wagner had written an opera called Tannhäuser and the Minnesänger Contest at Wartburg in 1845, and he added a French twist and put it on at the Paris Opera in 1861 after 164 rehearsals. But Tannhäuser didn't go over well in Paris, and they shut it down after 3 days. The Emperor of Brazil wanted to put on Wagner's operas, but nothing came of it. And Wagner continued to try to find a place for his German musical romance shows while the war between the states was raging in America. The King of Bavaria died in 1864, and Bavaria had just been united under Prussia, and the new King Ludwig II was 18 years old and had seen Wagner's Lohengrin in 1860, and then he'd gone to see Tannhäuser. And both of these operas were from the old rock songs, telling about the search for the Holy Grail and the anonymous Crusader knights. Lohengrin was where Wagner wrote the Here Comes the Bride music for the wedding scene that became so popular. And when Mad King Ludwig became Wagner's biggest fan, Wagner's money troubles were for the most part solved. There was a predominance of Jewish opera composers because the Christian churches preferred to listen to the pipe organ because it was louder and could be heard by more people in their huge cathedrals. And one theory about Jewish composers was that the Jews had invented the violin, and they always brought them along when fleeing persecution because the violin was lightweight and easy to carry. But then again, the violin had probably been invented by the Italians. Wagner continued to attack Jewish composers in a vain attempt to knock down the competition, but despite help from the Mad King Ludwig starting in 1864, Wagner would always have trouble with money. The Mad King pushed Wagner's Tristan and Isolde into performance at the Bavarian State Opera House in June of 1865, and it was conducted by Hans von Bülow, whose wife had just given birth to Wagner's daughter, and they named the daughter Isolde. Von Bülow was married to Liszt's daughter Cosima, and the von Bülows already had 2 girl children. And while everyone knew about Wagner and Cosima, von Bülow refused to divorce her, even when a second Wagner daughter would be born that they would name Eva. Cosima's father, Franz Liszt, looked like the guy who played the composer in the movie The Money Pit. And when Wagner's son Siegfried was born in Wagner's house, von Bülow finally granted Cosima a divorce in July of 1870, and she would marry Wagner in August. Despite the Mad King's sponsorship, the Bavarians were offended by Wagner's behavior with women, and Ludwig II had to send him out of the country within 6 months of the opening of Tristan and Isolde on the 10th of June in 1865. When Wagner was forced out of Bavaria, the Mad King Ludwig let him live in a nice house in Switzerland by Lake Lucerne, where he would finish writing Die Meistersinger within the year. And Minna died of a heart attack in Dresden the month after Wagner moved to the Mad King's house by the lake in December of 1865. Wagner married Cosima the same year Bismarck united Germany in 1870, and Bismarck encouraged the fatherland to adopt a flag of red, black, and gold colors that was meant with the gold stripe to include their cultural brothers in Austria, while the official flag was the red, black, and white colors of Prussia. And Wagner became a national treasure because he was providing the new unified Germanic realm with a definition of what it was to be German. With Wagner's growing importance, Germany forgave him for the troubles over the Year of Revolutions in 1848, and they let him move to Bayreuth in Bavaria, and the Mad King gave him 100,000 thalers to build a new opera house specifically designed for his new kind of opera. The opera house at Bayreuth would be completed in 1875, with Wagner's epic Ring trilogy performed in 1876, and the cruel, greedy dwarf in the Ring operas might just as well have been a Jew, and the Golden Ring was Wagner's manifestation of the curse of marriage, and the power of the ring came into being only after one had renounced love. Many people enjoyed Wagner's music simply because it was something different, and for the first time in the new theater at Bayreuth, the house was darkened while the stage stayed covered in light. And before Wagner and his innovative Bayreuth, the entire audience had been lit up because seeing who was there was part of the fun. Wagner had first published the words to his Ring operas in 1963 at the age of 51 after living in a hotel and drinking every day all day long. And the new young King Ludwig II loved these old German folk stories about the days of chivalry and the fearless knights on crusade, and he spent a great deal of money fixing up his castle and adorning the walls with paintings and frescoes of them, and he also gave a lot of money to Wagner towards bringing the old rock songs back to life. When the recalcitrant church people who thought knights in armor were too far removed from what had become of the church, they began calling Ludwig gay. Wagner told the new young king that music was better than religion, and Ludwig thought that was a great idea because he hated the horrible church services his parents forced him to attend. And people likewise had to sit through interminable hours of Wagner's opera because he was a friend of the king. The original rock songs had been repeated until people got sick of them, and the rock stars became theater actors who stayed in one place so people could come to see them rather than the singers traveling between villages. And with the invention of the printing press, the Minnesonger poetry could be shared on paper. And after poetry came the newspapers and printed pamphlets that fueled the Year of Revolutions in 1848. Pamphlets were popular because the message could be delivered without people having to dress up to attend the theater. And pamphlets were usually free, pinned up in public places and distributed liberally without having to pay for a newspaper. While opera was weighty and serious, the theater was raucous and lively. And the operas had a vocal chorus that set the background mood for the story being acted upon the stage, and those in the audience who had come often enough to learn the lines and songs were not discouraged from reading, from singing along with the chorus. German music had deep roots in the culture, with state-sponsored opera houses and theaters. And going to the theater was cheaper than going to the opera because the theater didn't have to hire an orchestra and pay the musicians. Private families would hire musicians to play in their chambers, and Nietzsche said that Schiller was more interested in mood than in meaning, which made him like a statue of a god without a head. Schiller had written Ode to Joy in 1785, and Ludwig Beethoven used it in his Ninth Symphony in 1824, and Beethoven said that Ode to Joy was about what it felt like to escape from an abusive father. German churches sponsored composers for the musical portion of their services, and the choir masters were the revolutionaries of their day, bringing new music to conservative old cathedrals. And Johann Strauss sprung to popularity with his new music called the waltz, that was described as, quote, mainly violent exercise on the polished parquet, close quote, the Cactus Throne, page 36. Johann Strauss had gotten into trouble in the year of revolutions in 1848 when he played the French revolutionary anthem on the streets of Vienna, while Beethoven had found favor with the German nobility and had died in 1827 at the age of 56 before the riots of 1848. Ludwig Beethoven had been born in Germany in Bonn in 1770, and Mozart was alive at the same time, and wealthy aristocrats liked to create child prodigies by forcing their children to play the piano endlessly, believing their offspring to have innately superior musical skills. Beethoven had been performing his music when Lewis and Clark set out for the Wild West, and when Beethoven started going deaf in 1799 at the age of 28, it had probably been the result of being beaten about the head in childhood by his father. Theater had been frowned upon by the church, so music was the primary source of popular entertainment, and opera was for people who aspired to uphold culture and education and hold an acceptable place in higher society. Writing was art, but not half as much fun as live music, and art was not just painting or sculpture or architecture, but music was art when it tried to communicate some meaning or message, even though lack of meaning could be a statement by the artist, and Nietzsche said that art was only as good as its potential audience. Nietzsche was an educated, civilized man, and the weirdest thing about Nietzsche was that he was so normal. And Nietzsche was born in Rocken in Germany on the king's birthday in 1844, and he was named Friedrich Wilhelm after the king, but they also called him Fritz. Nietzsche's grandfather's name was Friedrich August Ludwig Nietzsche, and he'd come from Poland with the name Nitsky that meant with poverty in Polish. And when his first wife died, leaving him with 7 children, Nietzsche's grandfather married a woman 22 years his junior who would give him 3 more children, one of whom was Karl Ludwig, who would become Nietzsche's father, and he would be a Lutheran minister at the Rocken Church and would die when Nietzsche was 5 years old. Nietzsche's mother's name was Franziska, and she'd been the catch of her hometown. And her father was also a pastor in a neighboring village. And Franziska was married when she was 17 years old, and her husband Karl Ludwig was 30. Nietzsche's mother, Franziska, had been given a handful of servants and a coach for her wedding, and Karl Ludwig's mother and 2 stepsisters lived in the house with them. So Nietzsche grew up in a house with 5 women after his baby brother Ludwig died young. Nietzsche had been born right away and didn't talk until he was 2.5 years old, and his father liked to play cards and also enjoyed putting on plays, so the house was full of music and poetry, and their home was also a farm, so they ate well. All the relatives living in the house were at least a decade older than Franziska, so Nietzsche's mother used her children for company while the husband locked himself in his study to avoid the women's arguments. Nietzsche stayed in his room reading books, and in September of 1848 his father fell down the stairs and hit his head, and he would be dead the following July. Because cancer is often started by a crushing injury, as evidenced in the process of cloning, where a cell is brought to the brink of death and then injected with genetic material, it was very likely that the father had a raging brain tumor. Franziska wrote in her diary about some medicine her husband had been taking, medicine he liked so much that he wanted to give it to everyone in the family without waiting for them to get sick, but Franziska had refused to take it. C. Blunk, Friedrich Nietzsche, page 29. After the father's death, the family moved to the city, and Nietzsche did so well in school that he was awarded a scholarship to the best school in Germany, the same school where Fichte and Schlegel had graduated. And Nietzsche attended for 6 years and got very good grades, but he almost didn't graduate because he flunked math. It was a boarding school, and they let him slide because it would have looked bad to have such an excellent student fail to graduate, and instead they held Nietzsche back a year. The school had been built as a monastery in the days of the Lost Crystal and was 700 years old, and when Martin Luther came along, they had kicked out all the monks and turned it into a school. There were no state-run schools at the time Nietzsche attended, but there were a series of different private schools, depending on your social class and ability to pay. And Nietzsche's school was like the German military schools, but they trained teachers instead of soldiers, and part of the curriculum was learning languages in depth, including Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and French. It was a privilege to attend that school, and Nietzsche would have been a classmate among the best of the aristocratic young men of Germany, and the library had 15,000 books and decent science labs and plenty of musical instruments and a substantial art collection. Nietzsche started a literary club with his friends called Germania, and he joined a student dueling club, and he fought a duel and was given a scar, but Nietzsche quit the student club after a few months, and Hitler would finally put an end to dueling in Germany. As a teenager, Nietzsche had been well behaved to a fault, and in later life, people who read his writing were amazed to meet Nietzsche and find him to be such a polite person. When Nietzsche was young, he wrote piano music, and he liked to preach funny sermons, and he also wrote reams of poetry and managed 30 pages of an autobiography when he was 14 years old. In school, Nietzsche sang in the choir and won the annual preaching contest where the king attended and had been very impressed with Nietzsche. And he liked to go swimming and hiking but hated gym class, and Nietzsche wore glasses and became sickly with rheumatism and suffered from headaches. Nietzsche had 2 best friends in school, one of whom would become a Sanskrit professor studying the origin of the Aryan language from India. And with his health problems, Nietzsche started hanging out with the wrong crowd and was caught drunk at the railroad station, and his friends were expelled, but soon Nietzsche stopped misbehaving and did great on his achievement tests, even though he still struggled with math. When he graduated in September of 1864, Nietzsche went to Bonn University for further schooling, and in Bonn he went to concerts and to the theatre, and he went for tea at the homes of his professors, and he went for firelit walks along the Rhine during the wine harvest, and Cézanne was his favorite painter.